where we plan to delve deep into cultural racketeering, the fact that this is not a victimless crime, and we'll be exploring, I guess, the vulnerabilities of the arts and antiquities market and how they've been shaped by inadequate international policy, a vulnerable banking system, illicit networks, the playground that is the internet, and legal challenges. My name is Shauna Kinnair. I am a director at the Clooney Foundation for Justice, but I have no intention of doing any of the hard lifting this morning. I'll leave all of that to my amazing panel. And the structure of the morning will be that everybody here beside me will do a brief intro. They'll give you their elevator pitch essentially about who they are, what work they've done, and then we'll get deep into a nice dynamic conversation. And then, of course, we will throw to the audience for questions, including our online audience. So without further ado, I'll throw to my esteemed colleague, also from the Clooney Foundation for Justice, so I'm rather biased when I say she also is amazing. Antonia.
Thanks, Shauna. Hi, everyone. My name is Antonia David. I am one of the legal program managers at the Docket, which is an initiative by the Clooney Foundation for Justice. I'm a lawyer. I'm based here in DC. And for the past about 2 years now, I've been working on our Antiquities project, which you'll get to hear a lot about today. Just briefly, the Docket itself, as an initiative, is very focused on accountability for victims of international crimes, so victims of war crimes or crimes against humanity, genocide, things like that. And generally, we're a team of sort of lawyers, investigators that put together almost case files, evidence, and try to work with prosecuting authorities, investigation authorities to then bring these criminal cases. So what does that have to do with Antiquities, right? Our Antiquities project is a little different. So it's looking specifically at dealers and galleries that are located in market countries, and I know we'll unpack a little bit of this more throughout the session. By looking at dealers, galleries, and market countries, so the US and Europe from our perspective really, and how they are complicit sort of in engaging in the trade of looted antiquities. So how they are kind of driving demand in the market, how they are funding these networks, and sort of our approach to this is trying to hold those individuals accountable, either for something like financing terrorism or complicity in war crimes even. Yeah, and I think I'll keep that as my elevator pitch for now.
Hello? Sorry. Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Clooney Foundation for inviting us to speak today on behalf of the Antiquities Coalition about the illicit trade in art and artifacts. I'm sure you've all read adventure novels, seen Hollywood films about tomb raiders and art smugglers, but in reality, these crimes are not being carried out by the likes of Indiana Jones or Lara Croft or Thomas Crown, but from a wide range of bad actors, ranging from opportunistic criminals to organized crime, armed insurgents, and even terrorist organizations like Daesh. We created the Antiquities Coalition to fight back. We're founded in 2014. We're a think and do tank, as we say, based here in Washington, which seeks to unite a diverse group of experts dedicated to combating these crimes. So we are archaeologists, but also lawyers, myself included, former government officials, representatives from the private sector, responsible players in the art market, and again, others who were dedicated to this shared mission. And we partner with a wide range of others, including governments, particularly the U.S. Department of State, but also foreign governments around the world, other nonprofit organizations, and leaders in the private sector. Of course, as long as there have been tombs, there have been tomb raiders. You've probably seen that King Tut's tomb was looted in antiquity. And certainly as long as there have been civilizations, there have been enemy armies waiting on the next hill to come in and plunder them. But what we're seeing today is these crimes are taking place on a scale never before seen in history. due to a wide range of reasons. The world, of course, is getting to be a smaller place. Technology is helping looters and also at the same time, developing faster than law enforcement and our laws can fight back. And also there's a growing demand. And those in the room would probably know better than I, but our colleagues in criminology have repeated to us multiple times that an illicit trade has never been defeated at its source. It's always a matter of combating the market and the demand. So again, we created the Antiquities Coalition to raise awareness of these crimes, particularly at senior levels within the public and private sectors, the decision makers who can change policy, change laws, and start recognizing these as the serious crimes as they are, not just a threat to our culture and history, but also to human rights, to national economies, and even to global security. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Helena Arose, to say a little bit more about how we do this and introduce herself.
Thank you, Tess. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to the Clooney Foundation for having us and to the IACC, my acronyms. Also, it's been a great conference. We really appreciated the invitation and the chance to connect with a lot of new people outside of our normal sphere, I guess. As Tess said, my name is Helena Arose. I'm the project director at the Antiquities Coalition, and I work with Tess. I am an archaeologist, but I admit that I'm not a lawyer. So just to build on what she said about our work, we were founded by our chairman, Deborah Lair, and incorporated as a nonprofit in 2015. And as Tess mentioned, we're leading the international campaign against cultural racketeering. We work around 4 main priorities: championing better law and policy, closing U.S. markets to illicit antiquities, convening with purpose, and encouraging responsible markets and trade practices. As Tess mentioned, we also run an award-winning think tank that helps governments, law enforcement agencies, and the private sector, also other decision makers, better understand these challenges. This is a really complex trade that involves a lot of different stakeholders, so we like to bring expert voices outside of academia and within it to members of the government and policymakers and decision makers. And we actually just had a new policy brief come out, it's already Friday, on Tuesday, on monuments, conserving, deaccessioning, removing monuments, and how that can incorporate heritage professionals. And if anyone's interested in writing for our think tank, we always look forward to proposals and would be happy to publish things on this subject. We also have a number of task forces that have developed over 80 concrete recommendations. We have one for the G20, we have one on financial crimes in the art market, and we have one on cultural racketeering in general. That was our first. Through this work, our message is that cultural racketeering is not just a threat to our shared history, but to the legitimate art market, to human rights, to national economies, and to global security. For too long, public policy treated cultural racketeering as a victimless crime, white collar, limited to the elite, if it even treated it as a crime at all, and really siloed efforts to fight crime to heritage experts who are not equipped to fight crime, for better or worse. And really the illicit trade in cultural objects is a crime first and foremost, just like any other type of illicit organized crime. And it can be described as a failure of governance, of law, of diplomacy, of civil society, but not a preservation failure. Like Tess said, it cannot be solved by better archaeology, conservation, restoration, but by strengthening law enforcement, international cooperation, and economic integrity. So that's what we're trying to do through our work at the AC, and we're really, again, happy to be on this panel today and look forward to the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Layla Hashemi, and I am a researcher and data analyst at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center. Thank you to our panel organizers, to Shauna, to my fellow panelists. It's great to see you all, and to all of you for being here so early this morning. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the Countering Looting of Antiquities in Syria and Iraq project, also known as CLASSY. So this research was run by TraCCCC at George Mason University and funded by the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Counterterrorism. Both Iraq and Syria have been heavily impacted by war that is associated with terrorism. This has led to a surge of looting of archaeological sites across the region, as well as the production of counterfeits. The trafficking of cultural heritage is often concentrated in conflict regions and generates substantial revenue for conducting acts of violence on local and international scales. So we can see that this is really a cyclical process. Precarity begets looting, and looting funds insecurity, violence, and other forms of illicit trade. And the Classy Project's online investigation team collected and analyzed primary data and examined the complex and non-transparent trafficking processes involved in this trade. Antiquities trade data was predominantly gathered from publicly available sources, which provided globally reaching, no questions asked sales opportunities for vendors. So a lot of this is happening with impunity. Social media platforms, as many of you might know, such as Facebook, are used to advertise and sell potentially looted objects. And in the course of our research, several digital tools were used to test the most effective methods for online investigations and countering this type of transnational crime, which I'm happy to talk about in our Q&A. Our research also acknowledged that one of the major stimuli of trafficking is the global demand, which some of you have already mentioned, and it therefore sought for ways to promote responsible purchase and collection of objects. To implement this project, we had a very amazing team that I'm very honored to have worked with, a multilingual team of archaeologists, antiquities specialists, and criminal network investigators to carry out the analysis of the current state of the online market. New technologies are improving the Is that fine? Okay. Okay. Mike was one of those people, so he's laughing, but I don't know why he's, yeah. New technologies are improving the quality of counterfeits, and the democratization of the market, which I'm hoping to talk about as well, has introduced new actors who are often ill-equipped to detect fakes. So this really shows our need to develop regulations that address the specific challenges of online trade. Efforts must be made to decrease demand for antiquities with questionable provenance and to promote responsible collection of cultural objects. Buyers should be made aware that the lack of due diligence promotes not only the destruction of heritage, but also the production of forgeries, and that all this together can fund acts of terrorism and violence. Finally, and as we've been speaking about this entire week, we must address the underlying corruption that facilitates these transnational crimes. Full stop. More on our Classy research can be found in our book. I will get it. It's called Antiquities Smuggling in the Real and Virtual World. Thank you. Came out with Routledge in January. You can purchase the title through Routledge, and you can use the code AEV22 for a 20% discount. I'd also love to give a thank you to Dr. Shelley, director and founder of TRAC, and we have our deputy director, Judy Dean, who also worked on this project. Thank you to Dr. Shelley for her support of this multidisciplinary excellent team, and for all of the important work that we do at TRAC.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, although I think I was misled as to why we're presenting today. I expected to be auditions for Hamilton. You know, I got my powdered wig back here for the king role, but we'll go with what we've got. I want to take my shot. Anyway, I want to thank you for attending. It is early in the morning and day 5 of a very long conference, so there's a lot. I'm sure there's a lot that has gone through, and people don't think of antiquities in the same areas as the Q&A will get into about. This is not something that's on a lot of people's minds when you think about illicit revenue and marketing. My own particular work is in training of financial investigations. I train largely to, well, I've done training in the intelligence communities, federal, state, and local in the United States, and some international. To the Classy project, which I was able to engage with when the project was ongoing. One of the biggest challenges we had ties directly to the issue of corruption. Because after we built this program and we had a training course we were ready to deliver, the question came in, who are we training? And are we giving the bad guys the tools to, you know, and that's a challenge I always have in my training, because I teach to very specific techniques and methods. So who am I teaching when I work this project? So that's the challenge that's in here. In Antiquities, the sector, the processes are very similar to the processes you'll see in other types of financial crime. They're going to use fronts and shells, they're going to use bankers, they're going to use gatekeepers, they're going to use the same process depending upon the sophistication of the network and how far they're going to make things work. And we'll talk about that in the Q&A when we get there, but understand that that is the challenge. Very quickly, in my own background, I started as a federal investigator. I don't say FBI because I was not FBI. I was the guy that everyone did not like. I worked in the Inspector General community, which meant that not only did I pursue go after cases of people who did fraud against the government relative to the money they received in contracts and grants, I would then turn around and go after the people that were doing programs because if they were doing anything incorrectly or illegally. So we had our own level on both sides. So I was hated by everybody. So that's why this opportunity here, being able to apply financial investigation techniques to a very unregulated, very vulnerable sector, hoping to cast additional light, get more involved in helping people better understand how to address this challenge so that we can, the bottom line to this all, and then I'll close with this. The bottom line to this all is when you can make something unprofitable, then that is the direction. We have the illicit activity. Everybody wants to deal with the artifact being dug out of the ground and go, but who actually pays attention to the money that follows? Because remember, at the end of it all, there's profit, there's money associated to this. If you can take away the ability for it to be profitable, maybe they'll do something else. And then they won't destroy history. They won't destroy culture. They won't destroy the things that are even more valuable than the artifact itself. So, looking at this wonderful panel, I am the artifact here, obviously. And I look forward to your questions when we get there.
Great stuff. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to our really, really brilliant panel and to all of you for showing up this morning. It is Friday and we realise everybody's tired, but we will keep this as dynamic as possible. So I think listening to all of you there, it's all fascinating, but I'd really like to scale back a little, and I think everybody in the room understands that, cultural destruction is an atrocity in itself, but what about the human side of things? And, I've heard it being called a war crime by colleagues, one in particular who sits beside me. Antonia, do you want to unpack that point and tell us about the human element and the fact that this is not a victimless crime? I think that's really important.
Sure. So I think one way to start answering that question is really how we came to this project. Because as I sort of mentioned in the introduction, right, we're a team of international lawyers, investigators. Our usual types of cases involve what you might think of for war crimes, right? One of my other cases right now is Ukraine, very much sort of your traditional war crimes, crimes against humanity case. So Antiquities looked a bit different, but we came to this project because specifically we were looking at certain conflicts, and our approach focused really on the MENA region, so Middle East, North Africa. And so we started looking in particular at Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, trying to understand what is funding conflict, right? Every terrorist group, armed group is using funds to recruit members, pay their current members, buy arms, facilitate travel, all the things that let them do their violations, their crimes. And so when we were looking at those sources, Antiquities is fairly high on the list, right? Along with sort of the ransom, oil, natural resource, the things you expect. And Antiquities was kind of a strange outlier. So that's sort of how we came to this, and we still come to this sort of from the perspective of we want to be able to stop the funds so that the violations stop happening, right? So that the crimes against victims and survivors stop happening. Specifically in those areas, right, because our project focuses on it, but as we'll hear and as I think we've heard a little bit, none of these strategies, none of these processes are particular to the MENA region. They're happening everywhere. So that's sort of how we came to the project. That's why our approach focuses on trying to link these chains. So we started from the ground. We started in these particular countries, looking at where the antiquities were being looted. We started tracing out the networks, because like any illicit network, there's a network, right, with intermediaries that are moving the items through certain transit countries. That makes it very easy to move, where you can kind of avoid customs, avoid, declaring that you're moving things. And then into market countries. So as I mentioned briefly, right, Europe and the US are sort of our main focus, because that's where most of the high-end galleries are located. And so kind of tracing that process out, how do the items, when they get to especially certain European countries, how do they get laundered? How do they get whitewashed? How do they, in the matter of a few weeks, create kind of fake provenance, create, import documentation to make it seem like this item has been on the market forever? So from tracing out those networks to being able to see this not as, like the panel has been saying, like not as just a crime of looting and of destroying cultural heritage in the countries where the items are from, but actually as a whole network of organized crime where the people in the market countries at the end are benefiting, creating the demand, are funneling money, right? The items are moving one way, the money is flowing the other way. So how that money is actually funneling really all the way back to the groups, the organizations, terrorist organizations included, who are looting these items from the ground and then using that money to commit crimes. And so that was sort of how we approached this project, and why sort of our position on this is that we want to be able to try to bring great cases of these more serious crimes, of terrorism financing, of complicity in these crimes. I can talk about it a bit more later, but sort of there's the legal standards around, especially things like complicity in war crimes. You don't have to sort of, even if you're that far removed from where the crimes are actually happening, you don't have to share the intent of the terrorists. You don't have to, I'm buying this antiquity because I want to send money because I want them to commit these crimes. So you don't have to have this shared intent. You just have to know that the money that you're sending is going toward groups that might be committing these crimes. So a lot of our project has been kind of trying to figure out where the dealers and the galleries are located that are engaging in these sort of illicit trades, and then also what does the law look like in that country? What kind of really serious crimes can you pursue against these dealers and galleries?
That's really interesting. What I'm actually very curious about is what, and I want to throw this to you, Tess, actually. I think we're all aware that arts and antiquities have been financing some of the worst villains in the last century. The Nazis, the Taliban, Daesh, you mentioned. We even spoke about the IRA before breakfast this morning, Tess. But what has changed? Like, what is different now? And is there any sense that the lack of policy perhaps has shaped that?
So I think I've been working in this area for 20 years now, starting off in Cambodia, where we now know the Khmer Rouge were actively involved in the organized looting and trafficking of archaeological sites over decades, as well as other armed insurgent forces in the country. And it's been such a change in recent years. 20 years ago, it was hard to get this topic on the radar, even of archaeological conferences. And now this is something that we're seeing on the official agenda of the Association of Southeast Nations, of the G20, certainly of the UN Security Council. And I think in part, even though, again, this has been happening for decades and longer, I think Daesh or ISIL putting it on the front page of the newspapers made it impossible for policymakers to look away. And this is, again, they were not the first to do this. They are certainly not the last. It's going on as we speak. But it made it unavoidable, and it helped to educate a lot of those in government and the private sector about this risk more broadly. As I mentioned, this is something that policymakers are tackling now, and we're thrilled to see this area get out of the ministries of culture, where it is usually sat, which is a problem in the United States when we are perhaps the only country in the world that does not have a Ministry of Culture. We don't have a natural home for this in the US government. But this issue is usually sat there and in other governments around the world. And that has, I think, stymied progress because, I mean, think if you live in a historic home, if it gets robbed, you don't call your historic preservation society, you call the police. But we have been expecting archaeologists, conservators, preservationists to combat trafficking, money laundering, tax evasion, sanctions evasions. These are completely different languages. So it's hugely important that this is now, again, being discussed within these intergovernmental organizations who have the convening power to bring together the ministries of culture, the ministries of justice, ministries of foreign affairs and finance, and really tackle it from a global perspective. We first saw this with Italy. Italy, of course, has a lot to lose from this illicit trade and has mounted one of the most robust responses in the world. Their famed Carabinieri is among the leading art squad in the world. I think our FBI is around 20 individuals, give or take, right now in this area. The Carabinieri have hundreds for a much smaller country. And so when Italy had the G20 2 years ago, they wanted to make this a track of that organization. That was continued by Indonesia last year, and we're optimistic that India, which took the seat this year, all signs are pointing to them making this a priority as well, also a country that has much to lose from this trade. So it's exciting to see that because, of course, the G20, with a few exceptions, the world's largest economies, are where the market for this material is. This is where the material is going. We added up the G20 markets, and at least based on the public statistics that we have, they make up about 95% of the global art market. So action by the G20 can make a big difference. And for what that action is, especially today's audience is well aware, I think more than your average audience, about the steps that are taken to combat financial crimes and corruptions. And it may surprise you that in many jurisdictions around the world, including the United States, the art market, the multi-billion-dollar art market, is not subject to anti-money laundering protections. To our knowledge, it's the only market of this risk and scale that is not. Why that is? I think it comes back to this misconception that this is a white-collar and victimless crime. It might end up as a white-collar crime, but it certainly does not start that way, and it's certainly, as we've heard, not a victimless crime. And beyond that, the art market is particularly vulnerable to abuse, even if it were regulated. I mean, you think of it, much art is very portable. Some of it, especially antiquities, can be quite small. You know, cylinder seals from Iraq you could put in your pocket. Coins, ancient coins, you could carry, outside of customs with no one giving you a second look. Also, though, the valuation can be, you can have two equally credible experts look at the same piece of art and be not just a little bit, but tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars off in what they think it's worth. And that can be tens or hundreds of millions of dollars off what someone will actually pay for it at auction. So all these factors make it very easy for criminals to manipulate, particularly as we're taking steps to close off these other potential channels, whether they be real estate or other means of money laundering and financial crimes. So the world is becoming aware, certainly, but again, there's a lot that can be done. There was an effort to add the art market to our AML protections this year. It's been removed from the bill. So this is very, very concerning to us because, again, we think it puts not just our heritage at risk, but also the legitimate players as well who might not know about the risk facing them.
That's really interesting. Tess, you listed a bunch of stakeholders there who we'll be all familiar with, and I wonder who perhaps is missing from the conversation as you see it. And Helena, I'll throw that one to you.
It's a good question. I think, like Tess said, one of the biggest challenges we faced is that this issue has been completely siloed from the expertise that's needed to combat it. So we're always pushing to include organizations like TRAC, the type of work that Mike does, the Clooney Foundation, starting to get justice, law enforcement, financial experts into the conversation, and also to try to educate them about this issue and the harms that it causes. There's other types of gray trades, so to speak, like wildlife trafficking, timber, things like this. Timber or lumber? Timber. And it can be very difficult to fight this kind of crime because there are legal ways that it can be sold, but there's also illegal ways. And all of the sources of antiquities now are difficult to prove legality. So I think one group of stakeholders that we continue to want to build on is law enforcement and legal experts. I think we've had a lot of success with law enforcement, and particularly with law enforcement in the United States. There's the Antiquities Trafficking Unit out of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that maybe you've probably seen many headlines in the news of pieces that they've seized to be repatriated, and the great work that they've done since their founding. Also, FBI, HSI have been very successful in their cases, but they're small in number in terms of their team, their staff, their resources. Excuse me. Beyond that, we see, even though our law enforcement is so successful, we see kind of a lack of follow-up in the judicial system. And this has really made efforts more challenging just because there's no accountability for the crime. So I could list numerous examples, but just ones from this year even. Michael Steinhardt, the billionaire, was charged with antiquities, looting, and trafficking. He had $70 million worth of items seized off of him, which he had to return, repatriate, which was a huge success for law enforcement. But what Tess could probably describe better is he received what's basically a deferred prosecution agreement, which is his punishment was he's no longer allowed to collect antiquities for the rest of his life, and he's about 80. So, I mean, just imagining if I stole $70 million worth of cars and all I had to do was give it back and never buy a car again, it's kind of ridiculous. And that's another one of the problems with the art market and why it's so hard to combat is these crimes are taking place, in these elite circles. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of power. And so I would say maybe that's another stakeholder group that we're always trying to raise awareness. And there are some really good examples. For example, Jim Clark, who founded Netscape, once he learned about this trade and the objects that he had that were illicit, he voluntarily returned them. And you may have seen there was an article in The Guardian recently where a man realized that his grandmother had objects in her collection that were illegally stolen, and just from reading the news, he was able to figure out how to repatriate them. So we're looking to do outreach to the public just because it does make a difference. Every article we see makes a difference. It makes a difference to us. It makes a difference to when we go to talk to policymakers. The biggest question we always get when we talk to policymakers is, how much is this illicit trade worth? How much money is being lost? And you just can't give them a number. And so that makes it really difficult. And I understand why they want to know. That's how policymakers operate. We can try to give them these snapshots. Like I mentioned, Michael Steinhardt, there's an antiquities trafficker who was just convicted in India. He's Indian-American named Subhash Kapoor, who had $145 million worth of material seized off of him at the time that HSI came. And he's just one guy, so it's the huge amounts of money out there. But as Tess mentioned, it's very difficult to value art and antiquities. Values can differ. And also, we are always trying to say that it's not the dollar amount that's the problem here. So getting that message out to different stakeholders who can help us on both sides is, I think, really important.
Mike?
Yeah, if I could jump in on that really quick. I agree with all the concepts. But here's the reality. The reality is, relative to this type of crime, we don't have enough people in law enforcement alert to the elements of it. They are trained in all other types of financial investigation investigations included, financial crime. But while we have people that are truly expert, New York and the FBI has a unit, and there's some great people. When you look at the amount of activity that's going on, applied to the number of people that are being given to do the work, it's just not there. This is why the lack of regulation is so critical as an issue that has to be addressed. Because just like in every other type of financial-oriented crime, and that's the way you have to look at this. You have to look at it as this is all based for money. You know, they want the money. They want the value in this, right? So when you're dealing with that, we have regulations that require reporting of suspicious activity. That is part of that is not part of this industry, where those experts that see that activity, that identify those people, they're the ones that report it out. A critical piece to keep in mind is law enforcement is reactive. It's not proactive. It's very rare they start on their own cases. They will get information and then launch a case. They'll assess it. They will get suspicious activity reports. They'll assess it and maybe go forward with the case. That is the way it works around the world, quite frankly, unless you have an intelligence agency that ties in, but that's the only exception. So when you're dealing with this as a particular type of activity, we just don't have enough information out there to demonstrate to these stakeholders that it's important they be aware. I did a presentation a couple months ago to a banking industry meeting in Phoenix, okay, and I reminded them of the four-letter word they all hate to hear but live with every day, and that is risk. So I put the construct in, and this is what my recommendation to you folks, put it in the context of risk. What is the risk to them, the banks, which put the money and provide resources of financing or processes to their customers? Because if it's an illicitly gained, and the new owner may not realize that, right? So it gets repatriated. Well, that's value lost. Who's out on that? The insurance industry probably would have some impact. So you can see there is loss along the way based upon the processes we're dealing with. Those are stakeholders that understand finance, they understand processes, they understand documentation, they know the questions to ask. They have to be fed this additional information on how to make it happen. And the final point, yeah, repatriation. So they're out the money, so what? You know, it's like if I had a kilo of cocaine here and a statue. We know that that's not good. Right? The cocaine is not going to be very good to have, right? Okay? The statue, it's been in the family for years. And, you know, why are we going after that? So the perception is different, and it's easier to put the statue into the common use of life, quite frankly, so it's harder to identify and work the investigation. So the stakeholders have to be not just the people that are expert in the field, but the people who are working in the financial structures that support these activities. And that's where I would say there has to be an emphasis on that.
Is there a sense, I mean, what can businesses and finance do better? Like, how can they identify suspicious activity? Or is there a sense maybe that they're just perhaps turning a blind eye? Is it easier to turn a blind eye?
Oh yeah, and the concept under FATF, those of you that are familiar with Financial Action Task Force, the whole term is willful blindness, right? Okay, not knowing what I don't have to ask, I don't know. And that's the problem, is they don't necessarily know what to ask, so they can't necessarily pull that information out. This is where the training element or the informational element, those systems all work by pattern analysis. So by helping them develop a pattern analysis program, could identify more suspicious actors, resulting in suspicious reporting, resulting in investigations, moving things forward.
So there's a huge role, I think, of legitimate companies, but also the financial sector and the payments community. So really online transactions are facilitated through payment processors, credit cards, banks, as Mike was talking about. So one thing we could do is make transactions less frictionless and collect and monitor and analyze transaction data, which is easier said than done. So require reporting of suspicious activity, gather important information on customers that can aid law enforcement and other agencies seeking to detect and disrupt these illicit networks. And we really need data to investigate this online trade, and this data must be collected and shared before we can actually take action. And that's actually a discussion we were having last night, is there's a sort of reluctance to share that data, but we can't really do this work without that being shared. And there's initial reluctance, but I think TraC has proven that we can handle it safely. Also partnering with e-commerce platforms, so having worked on the online monitoring, and academia, as Helena so rightly pointed out, and others to collaborate to combat this looting of trafficking of cultural heritage. Again, gather and share data, and while there may be initial hesitancy, we have secure environments and enter contracts that can protect data sharing. We're currently actually working on detecting and disrupting illicit supply chains of PPE and pharmaceuticals, and so we've facilitated the seizure of nearly 60 million counterfeit respirators worldwide through a data sharing agreement with a private company. So I think that really shows the impact that kind of data sharing can have. And then as Mike was saying, admit that there's a problem, right? So I think a lot of these platforms, legitimate companies and also banks and payment processors don't want to admit that there's a problem, and that's sort of the first step, right? And then we can develop solutions that include all of the relevant stakeholders that we were talking about before. And it seems really simple, but just simply recognizing that cultural artifacts might be harmful, and to have law enforcement, other stakeholders having an eye on that and paying attention to it can really help raise awareness of the issue.
So that part is fascinating, like the supply chain and the internet and the social media channels, and that's your beat squarely, Layla. I mean, is there, what can law enforcement do there? Is it because there's just such a lack of experience, or this is just a whole new playground that we're not familiar with? This is so new. I mean, the IRA certainly weren't using Facebook or Twitter, thank God. But, what can we do now? We have some of the information. I know a lot of your research was done on the dark web and all that, but what can collectively our table do in terms of what's out there on the dark web, and how we can get maybe the tech firms involved, or bring them to the table at least, to come up with some of these solutions?
Absolutely. So I think there has been a huge democratization of the market with the internet, right? What was sort of once a niche market that was very exclusive community has now been opened up to almost anyone that's interested in learning about purchasing or even selling antiquities. We see more high volume, low value trade versus previous sort of high value, low volume trade. And anyone can access or make purchases, but they also don't have the ability or the subject matter expertise to know or evaluate or assess the object or distinguish between fakes and genuine products. So for the Classy project, we actually looked at 60 sites ranging from very large internationally recognized auction houses down to small-scale independent dealers operating on more decentralized e-commerce marketplaces like eBay, which is a huge... I don't want to call out particular platforms, but I think that that's what we should be doing here, so I'm going to call out particular platforms. We focused mostly on small objects, coins, and cuneiform. I think Tess mentioned that's pretty popular. They're very easily concealed because they're small and transported, and then they're less likely to be detected, the reason for which they're traded in large quantities. And we also looked at sales networks through participant observation on social media. We looked at some of the most popular social media sites. Many of you are probably still maybe on some of these, like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we found that venues like eBay and Etsy and the darknet are unique, and then they're sort of interactive sales platforms with social media elements. So in terms of what can be done, like a lot of these forums actually provide a lot of information on what's happening in these sales. There are lists of bad coin dealers on the internet that you can look at. And to your point on dark web trade, we actually didn't find any trade on the dark web, and that's because dealers can trade with impunity on the open web. So there's no reason for them to trade on the dark web, right? As a criminal or as a counterfeiter or a trafficker, a looter, you want to reach the widest audience possible, and dealing on the dark web or even accessing the dark web takes a level of technical sophistication that not everyone has, and so you're going to reach a wider audience just selling on the surface web. Can I talk about our findings? Do I have time to talk about them?
Absolutely.
Okay, lovely. So our sales monitoring led us to several findings. We confirmed that there's no reliable way of determining from online images whether any specific object was originally found in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere, or whether it's counterfeit. And this is due to usually the low quality of images. But I think that that's an important point for law enforcement or anyone kind of dealing in this trade, because you really have to touch the object, see it in person to really know if it's genuine. Many objects are sold with problematic provenance or no provenance at all, which prevents us from determining when they came out of the ground and understanding their ownership history. That's probably one of the biggest problems plaguing the market right now, is a lack of clear provenance, and has been the case in a lot of the examples that we've talked about today. Also, a growing problem is that this internet-based trade, antiquities are not sold as artifacts, but they're sold as toys, educational tools, jewelry-making components, so they're sort of misdescribed on these online marketplaces, and that kind of prevents us from, going after them. And then we mentioned the gray market. We have this mixing of genuine and illicit antiquities, which has been termed as piggybacking. And then, of course, sellers and buyers are always going to use false accounts or even alter egos to sell their objects. So they're obscuring their identities and hindering really our ability to track transactions. So not using the dark web, but using a lot of the anonymity of the internet to be able to get at this and make profits. So we have sort of three challenges, I think. One is that we're facing this gray market, blurred trade boundaries where sellers are combining licit and illicit objects. And I think that a lot of the panel is saying this, is like this idea that antiquities are very different from other, like, drugs trafficking, human trafficking, that are very explicitly illegal. It becomes an issue when you have this gray market. The second challenge is that is the no provenance, really can't be overstated. And the third is there's been sort of just this flooding of the market with counterfeits and fakes, and these new actors that are on the internet that are really trying to make what is very a high profit, low risk trade to increase their revenues.
Fascinating. I'm just looking at the clock. We'll get through a few more points, and then we definitely want to throw to the audience for questions. But I do want to talk about the law and criminal law specifically. Antonia, talk to me.
About criminal.
Yes.
Yes, so we use criminal law to try to, as you probably are gathering, we are a little bit on the accountability side of this equation. We do some advocacy, especially with our colleagues here, but the docket is really focused on the accountability side, trying to hold some of these perpetrators accountable to actually sort of dismantle the networks, right? And so, as you've heard a bit, I think already, none of us are fans really of repatriation. So seizing the item and then just returning it. We've mentioned a few things about it already, so I won't repeat those, but one of the key things for us is also, even if the items are seized, the money has already gone. The money has been spent. The money has gotten to where it needed to go. The item is now just back sort of to the origin of the network. So nothing really no one has been held accountable. And then additionally, in a weird way, from some of the people, so as part of our work, we conduct field work. We have gone to some of the transit countries in these chains to speak to people who are sort of adjacent to these networks or involved in them. And for some of them, it's come up a bit now that actually seizing the items and repatriating them is a way to legitimize the dealers, because it shows to the market the items that we have are real. They're going back to their countries of origin. You know, we deal in the legitimate items. We're not selling the fakes or anything else, or rebranding something from a different country. So the kind of seizure hasn't been working. I think, as Helena also mentioned a bit, there's been, when there are sort of criminal investigations and prosecutions, which is very rare, sort of like the Steinhardt example is what's been happening, seizure, and then not much follow-up sort of from the prosecution side. But when there are sort of investigations, they're very much focused on smaller crimes, essentially like customs violations or tax violations, kind of art and property crimes, rather than seeing it as an organized crime. And so that's sort of where I think a lot of law enforcement is at right now. A lot of the advocacy, I think, has been around trying to get the key stakeholders into the conversations to change some of those approaches. And yeah, so the approach, as I mentioned, for us has been pushing not only investigations, but really pushing sort of for more serious crimes, war crimes, terrorism charges, because it would do a few things. It would actually recognize kind of the participation of these galleries for what it is, right? They're part of these networks, they're funneling money. It's not just, oops, I didn't pay the right taxes for this item that I brought in. So it would kind of be recognizing the real nature of these crimes and how they're participating in sort of funding conflict and funding looting on the ground. So capture the nature of them better. And it would also, hopefully, our hope is to actually dismantle the networks, right? Something like being, properly investigated for terrorism financing is something that is reputation destroying. It's something that you don't easily come back for, whereas something like, I paid the wrong taxes, that's just sort of seen as the cost of doing business. So that's why sort of we go after it from accountability in criminal law and specifically trying to go for more serious charges, which can only really be done, as we were saying, with getting the right people in the room to help kind of with our expertise and help do these kinds of investigations.
And I can't believe it would be an easy job to be bringing in the big art galleries in Europe and the US and trying to hold them to account. That's a hard job. That's a hard job. Okay, well, I think it would be really worthwhile going through our panel and maybe each of you suggesting recommendations to raise the stakes for the perpetrators. Tess, you want to take it off?
Sure, and I guess if we had a wish list, especially with the audience here today, again, would be to recognize, to remove this exemption that the art market has had from what are now standard anti-money laundering laws and regulations. In the United States specifically, our horribly named Bank Secrecy Act, I don't know why it is named this, but this is our primary anti-money laundering law. Under this, at-risk industries have to assist the U.S. government in preventing and fighting financial crimes. And so if you're selling boats, cars, planes, gemstones, jewelry, precious metals, even pawn shops, you're subject to this law. Again, art is the big exception. And when you think about it, an auction house's business model is not different from a pawn shop. It's the same exact business model, but instead of selling a stereo system, you're selling pieces that can reach into literally the hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is, we know this is being abused. We don't know how much because of the lack of these suspicious activity reports that Mike mentioned. Law enforcement don't have eyes into this market. But when they do look, they find something. For example, a relevant example today, back from the previous invasion of Ukraine, when those sanctions were issued, there was growing concern among Congress that they weren't being effective. And so the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigation started an investigation to find out why. And they looked at two brothers, the Rodenberg brothers. If you have seen the pictures of Putin playing judo, it's usually one of them who is in those pictures with him. They're very close with Putin, inner circle of the Kremlin. And this investigation found pretty readily that the Rodenbergs were evading sanctions through not just back alley dealers or the internet, but from the major auction houses in the country and a very prominent gallery to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. This was uncovered several years ago. The crimes actually took place several years before that. Those loopholes are all still open, and the Rodenbergs are on the sanctions list again. So, what is to stop them from doing the same route? Even more concerning, it was revealed in the report, if you read through the 200-page report that came out, that at least one of the auction houses knew the beneficial owner was the Rodenbergs. But there were no criminal charges, none of this, nothing happened. They were shamed a little bit in the press, and thus far, that's been it. So my top on my wish list would be that. Again, it doesn't fight trafficking specifically, but by upping the standards in the market, by requiring this paper trail, And trust me, we all hate paperwork. We're a nonprofit that works in Iraq. The paperwork we have to do for the U.S. government is, we complain about it just as much as anyone else. But we do know that it's to protect us, it's to protect others, and hopefully the art market, will begin to realize it will protect them as well from being misused by those who go and say, oh, this market's been closed off, this market's been closed off. This is a very easy market to manipulate. I'm going to put my attention there.
Helena?
Yes, I have two things. One I'll start with is, I think if I had to ask for a specific thing, it would be accountability for museums in the United States. I think one statistic that I try to talk about is that museums, according to a study done by the American Association of Museums for years, but most recently 2021, museums are regarded as the most highly trusted institution, ranking second only to friends and family, and significantly more trustworthy than researchers, scientists, NGOs, the government, media, and yet, from our field, we see them exhibiting looted antiquities, hiding provenance information, keeping acquisition policies secret. Like, none of this is in the public interest or deserving of public trust. We've said this before, but what other institution could put stolen property on display for years, return it only when forced, and then be praised? And so it's just a bit frustrating. And I think what we've all discussed is it's really difficult to get at the private collectors, the private market, the private dealers. You don't have this information. But frankly, they're following the model of our leading institutions. When the Met is engaging in this kind of behavior, as we've seen all year, all of these seizures, it's difficult to ask a private individual to do better than them. So I think having accountability for our museums, we know that law enforcement's taking note and viewing museums who engage in this material as criminals, which is what it should be. And I think raising awareness about that and having the public hold them accountable too, especially because they're really taking advantage of our trust. And I think that should be a big change. And hopefully with that change, we'll see changes in the private market as well. And so I would also ask, sadly, I don't know what each of you do for work, but as you fight corruption and hold institutions accountable, things like this in your work, not even to ask you to prioritize antiquities, but just keep it on your radar, keep it on your list, incorporate it into commodities that you're following. Look into, if you're investigating companies, always check this angle. I'm revealing my lack of knowledge about anti-corruption means, but we are here, the Antiquities Coalition certainly, and I'm sure I speak for my whole panel, to help, and we are looking for your help. So thank you, and I'll turn it to Layla.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would definitely agree that we're here to help and reach out if you need that. And I think Helena speaks a lot to what we do at TraC, which is finding patterns and trends and often anomalies, right? So just keeping an eye out for a suspicious, artifact that you see on a wall, or just knowing, as I said before, that art could be used for money laundering or nefarious purposes. So we do see a lot of patterns and trends in terms of the same smuggling routes being used to traffic other illicit goods. That's something for law enforcement and other enforcement bodies to look out for. And this movement of goods from source to transit through into destination countries is facilitated by, as you can imagine, corruption, right? So corruption, focusing on that aspect. There are also patterns in the way that objects are advertised online, and I think that goes for any object or product that we can talk about. We often start with a sort of broad outreach, like I was mentioning before, not selling on the dark web, but putting out an advertisement for anyone, and then quickly targeting those that are interested in the object, and then going into private or encrypted or one-on-one communication to complete that transaction. So recognizing that pattern in the way that objects are sold online. We also see a lot of convergence with other forms of crime. So in the Classy project, we notice convergence with weapons trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking as well. And I can't overemphasize the role of legitimate companies. So we really need their help. The private Facebook groups, the payment processors that I was talking about before. We saw a lot of false certification companies. We see falsification of documents, and those are all really important e-commerce marketplaces. We really can't tackle, I think, this issue without them. And the importance of online forums. So individuals are discussing in details and values of specific objects and sharing and asking for trade advice, which is happening on these platforms. So maybe regulating that a bit. And also just, I think, final takeaway is really tracking this evolving modus operandi of criminals. Because I feel like in this effort and in a lot of the efforts trying to track any sort of corruption or transnational crime, we're a little bit, one step behind the criminals. So kind of being aware of how they're quickly evolving. Criminals are very creative and they're constantly shifting their techniques and tactics to avoid detection. So I think with these methods, we can successfully combat the trafficking of cultural property through the use of powerful tools and partnerships, public-private partnerships, especially data analytics, like I mentioned before, in the digital era.
I have a much more direct approach with a lot of the things that just because of the nature of the work that I do. Give you a quick story. When I was training counterterror finance in the intelligence for the government, for 6 years I did that. A common story I would tell was about Al-Qaeda. And I would say, okay, this was especially when bin Laden was still alive. Well, okay, bin Laden's the target, right? So you take out bin Laden, what happens on a Tuesday, what happens on a Wednesday? There's a new guy in charge of Al-Qaeda. Take away their bank account. Take away their ability to buy the components for IEDs. Take away their ability to get arms. Interfere with their banking. Now you've caused a problem because all new roads and patterns and processes have to be redone by that organization. So you may not have stopped them, but you certainly have given them a very bad day. So in regards with putting that in context here, what we're dealing with are a lack of knowledge to the antiquities market itself. So really the sector, that information has to be translated to those that are viewing, and I speak from the financial side, those that see how that market and business transacts so that they can identify those things that are suspicious, that can cause an effective investigation. And the effective investigation will include experts such as at this table, except me, who can help fill in those gaps on that expertise to say this is why it's important. One other factor that's why these should be involved is, frankly, the word accountability has come up, and that's a critical word. One of the reasons I'm very pro-regulation in this area is because just like with financial institutions and like businesses, there is an accountability of having effective programs. It's not just that they can report, it's that they have to have a program that works. Tim Levine with Goldman Sachs, tying back to the 1MDB scandal, which has been mentioned several times at this conference. Okay, Goldman Sachs was fined millions of dollars. On top of the other things they were found to be operating illicitly on, the other problem was it's not that you didn't know what Tim was doing, it's that you should have known. And they were fining them because of their lack of ability to have knowledge. So what happens is by pushing that accountability factor into the financial sector, you'll increase that visibility. And that visibility can impact those networks.
Great stuff. And Antonia, real quickly, if you do have one last recommendation, and then we will throw to the audience.
Yes, on the topic of accountability, since that is our bread and butter, I will just say since there's been so few investigations, maybe the top of my wish list would be to, since this is about cross-border crime, to have more cross-border collaboration and sharing of information. So this is particular for law enforcement, right, or other sort of investigating authorities, but to actually, there's very little information, right, there's very little transparency in this market, but to actually be able to better share and collaborate and coordinate their activities, just because that's what the networks are doing, and that's how they're able to circumvent a lot of the accountability. So
great stuff. Okay, I don't see any questions from online, but in our physical audience, yes. Is there a microphone for the audience, or we're happy just to?
Should we pass one over?
Maybe you don't need one, it's an intimate room.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was a really interesting panel discussion. My name is Nicole Quijano-Evans. I'm with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Not a question, but a few comments from my side. I'm sure you all are aware that this year, in October, we had the Conference of the Parties to the UNTOC, and actually a resolution was tabled on cultural property, which I was very happy to see. As you said, it's a topic that has not received the attention it should have, and so the negotiations for that resolutions were very difficult. And usually what happens then, it's pretty much watered down and quite weak. Nevertheless, it was passed. It does call upon member states to make better use of the UNTOC Convention to treat cultural property as a serious organized crime, and also, you know, to put more emphasis on international cooperation, as you said. And this brings me to my next comment on law enforcement and cross-border cooperation. One comment, you mentioned it, there is a little bit of an overkill of training law enforcement. We have a project that trains customs in identifying what is trafficked in containers, for example. So we train them in wildlife trafficking, we train them in drugs, in arms. So customs have to be experts in everything, basically. Obviously, they cannot be. But what we can train them in is to really identify that what is on the shipping documents is not what is in the container. And that is what is important. And then the next step is, okay, they open the container, they see wood. Why should this be important? But to raise awareness that this might be wood that is of high value, that has been illegally logged in the Amazonas is important. The same goes for cultural property. So they see a carpet. And before, I had this experience, we had a training in the Philippines, and it was really the oh effect. We had, and the next day the guy comes and shows me a picture of a painting and carpets, and through this training they got the awareness, okay, this is something that is not what it was declared as. So it is very important to raise awareness among customs, among police. And we in UNODC, we do that. We have very successful programs, and I'm very happy to work with all of you. The problem is, because it is not really a priority for many member states, the funding is also not there. We have very successful programs in other areas that at the moment receive much more attention, like deforestation, wildlife trafficking. And we can apply the same mechanism, the same tools. Building a team, an interagency team with police, with investigators, with judges, prosecutors, where we really, raise their awareness, train them, and bring them together. So we have the mechanism, but it's also important to raise awareness among the donor community. And then the last point, which I forgot now, might come back. But yeah, just to emphasize, I think it is a very important topic. Also, the bringing together law enforcement and legal, the private sector, is very important. Great. There's a lot of information that can be shared between the private and the public sector. And I think, again, the UN, as you said, has a good convening power, and I think we can achieve some good things together. We can convene a meeting, with the private sector. Maybe there's some more push when it comes from the UN, but there needs to be also more political will from the highest level. This is my last point. So really, member states have to come forward and push this on the political agenda. Thank you.
Great stuff. I think there was quite a few hands. So we have about 10 minutes left. So let's couple more questions.
I'll try to be brief. I'm Louise Shelley at TRAC with Layla. And when you talked about India being probably ready to take this issue on, I thought of a visit I did with a friend to Kapoor's gallery on Madison Avenue before he became suspicious. And I was with a friend who's very knowledgeable in Indian art, who saw a Shiva there. And he asked him, and he remembered where he had seen this Shiva in situ in India. And so he said to Kapoor, I hope you have a very good provenance on this. And Kapoor answered, only the best. And then this was bought by the Australian National Museum that has had to return it. But the point that I think that Layla rushed over and needs a little bit more development is the importance of the fraudulent documents that are absolutely key to finding counterfeit masks and key to finding this problem with antiquities. Because if the Australian National Museum had unraveled this provenance a little bit before they paid $1.5 million for the Shiva, then this might not have happened. And so I want to have you talk a little bit more on the role of fraudulent documents.
Great stuff. I think, Tess, you want to go?
Thank you so much for raising that. And I think it again highlights, your very valid point highlights how much of a pass the art market has gotten in terms of laws and regulations. For example, the Shiva that the Australian Museum paid $1.5 million of taxpayer money, by the way, for, and then had to return. We see this story repeated time and time again. And as Helena mentioned, you're not going to see better behavior by a private collector than you're going to see by museums that have entire research staffs and legal staffs. But just to use a couple of examples that have passed muster, Kapoor would use his girlfriend's address and say it came from her collection. If you Googled this address, it's a walk-up in Queens. And so shouldn't that be a red flag that you don't need a PhD in Indian art to uncover? Like, literally Google map the address and be, I don't know if there was $1.5 million antiquity above a laundromat. Like this, maybe there was, but at least it's a red flag to check out. Another example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which if you've seen the New York Times is dealing with a new scandal in this field about every quarter. And again, once or twice, perhaps, we give them a pass, but it's becoming a regular occurrence. Google Met Antiquities HSI or Manhattan DA, and you'll have a whole week worth of reading because it's something that's repeated. And one particularly infamous example, They paid $4 million, again, a public institution, for this gold coffin. Kim Kardashian posed next to the gold coffin at the Met Gala. The picture circulated around the world so widely that it was actually seen by one of the looters in this coffin who never got paid, and reached out to law enforcement because he was quite bitter about this and provided video of it coming out of the ground that led to what is now a transnational investigation into a major criminal network that has roped in not only the Met, but the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and several key individual figures in the field. This coffin was bought, I believe, 2017. It was looted during the revolution, so it can be called a conflict antiquity. And the provenance paperwork for this was disproved by a 20-something-year-old analyst at the DA's office because it had Arab Republic of Egypt stamped on it. And the analyst was like, wait, the Arab Republic of Egypt's quite a recent country. Wikipedia, when was the Arab Republic of Egypt founded? And the country didn't exist when this export permit was supposedly drafted. So again, we're talking how many eyes looked at this permit at the Met. These are people, lawyers, PhDs in Egyptology, people who've devoted their life to Egypt, and they didn't know when, I know when the various Cambodian governments were created. How can a 20-something-year-old analyst without all of this knowledge? I think it comes to Mike's point of they didn't want to know, so they didn't look too carefully. But it's much easier to forge paperwork than it is to forge an antiquity. And so this is something we see a lot, that people get quite creative. And sometimes they're much harder to disprove than that. You have people who will find old catalogs from the 1800s and or 1900s and early 1900s and actually modify antiquities to look like the print description in there. So But the paperwork, and I think this is again why we need a tougher standard. They should have caught that. Also, when the Met was forced to return the coffin, for years they kept $4 million worth of antiquities bought at the same time from the same person. Shouldn't that have raised a red flag that they knew that this piece was looted, and they did not return those until HSI showed up at their door with badges in June? They kept them for years. There wasn't a task force. There wasn't a outside, the board's going to get an outside lawyer to investigate, and we're going to prevent this from ever happening again. Oh, we'll just keep these pieces until law enforcement shows up. Again, we can't ask more of an individual than we're asking of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And until that changes, I think individuals are going to continue to, unfortunately, get a pass on this.
Yeah, I think the case of the golden sarcophagus is quite shocking, as I scribble Kim Kardashian to our stakeholder list. I think we'll take maybe one more question. Let's see how we go.
Can I talk about the false document for just a moment?
Provenance document. Well, let's just take one more question, because I do want to hear from our audience. Yes? It's democracy. whoever.
This is super quick, I promise. I'm Daniel Bruce. I'm the Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. I thank the panel for this session this morning. It's so enriching to have fresh content and different perspectives in a conference like this. So thank you. It's been very educational. Super quick. You've talked about AML regulation in the US. We do a lot of this in the UK in terms of illicit financial flows and dirty money and have sought reforms over the years. We, through our own research on illicit financial flows, have seen the vulnerabilities in the art market in cash terms rather than antiquities terms. I just wondered is your sense that there is resistance from legislators to including the market in AML regimes, either in the US or in Europe, or is there just not enough kind of is there not enough of a head of steam behind this yet? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I can't if no one else is. Or Mike, did you want to?
That's yours.
I think it's actually been both. One is, again, complete lack of awareness that this is an issue. We've actually spoken to really famous AML experts who thought the art market was already included. And they were like, wait, what? They were shocked to find that it wasn't. I think the tide is changing. I think there is growing awareness, and I think there's been scattered political will in the United States. We've already seen this happen in the UK and the EU, which is putting pressure on us. So I think it's a matter of getting it across the final threshold. But again, we're constantly stymied by the fact that ignorance among this area, among policymakers, and also the power that this multi-billion-dollar art market has. I believe one of the major auction houses, just that we know of, spent over $1 million lobbying against the addition to the BSA. And there's not a counter force to that. Again, this is a little on our periphery. We're a two-person organization, and there's not, we don't have Wild Aid or the World Wildlife Fund or groups like this that are countering this multi-billion-dollar market. But I do think the time is changing. I think it's going to happen. Just because it's becoming so ridiculous that it hasn't, and that's becoming more and more apparent to our the House committees that are dealing with this. Mike, anything to add to that?
Very quick. No, I agree with everything that was said there. Kind of a related topic, and I think the UN would be critical in driving this forward. Given your example of the looter, there needs to be an international law called felony stupid, that on top of all offenses that they might be engaged in, the judge has the ability to say, and on top of that, I'm going to charge you with being so stupid you shouldn't even be involved in the scheme in the first place. So maybe you can help us with that.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Tess. Layla, do you want to throw in your last point? Because I know the provenance point is very
Oh yeah, and
very
especially the false documents. So I think that it is really important to emphasize this false certification companies and how people can just pull documents from the internet and manipulate them to be able to facilitate this kind of trade. And that speaks to the earlier point about we're duping consumers at that point. So it's already difficult enough for users, end users, customers to know if what they're buying is a looted antiquity. And so imagine you have falsified documents that then obscure that even more. So we've seen even the spoofing of verification sites in our work on the counterfeit respirators, where imagine you're putting in like lot codes and information to make sure you're verifying the authentic product, and those are being spoofed to tell you that a counterfeit product is actually genuine. So even the tools and mechanisms that we have to inform consumers are actually working against them. We also see and someone mentioned earlier about like false bills of lading, so misrepresenting documents of the goods that are inside of the container or the piggybacking mixing of these other things. And we actually incorporated this into our law enforcement training that Mike developed for our Classy project in our sort of case study and our examples. So I think all this really points for this need to have data analytics to be able to detect the manipulation of these documents, because otherwise, if you don't have that, you won't be able to find them.
Just off of that, and maybe to end, I know we've gone over time, but about the regulation, like, we really don't have time to wait. I think Tess is absolutely right, it's coming, but we're pushing really hard because, today and on this panel, we've talked a lot about the money and, just the crime that's facilitated by this, but to go back to the original point, which is that it's not just the cultural element, it is the cultural element too. So we were talking about Notre Dame the other day and the outpouring, when Notre Dame burned, just everyone, the horror that everyone felt around the world. And truthfully, we all know that scale is happening almost every day, every week, every month from looting. And we need to be pushing to move faster. I think Mike was saying this last night too. We need to be going faster in terms of how we're regulating and fighting this crime, because the loss that happens when we don't is really huge.
Great stuff. I'm actually going to park it there because I'm looking at the clock. But a huge thanks to our amazing panel. The rough takeaway points, if anyone wants them, I can read them out, or I can, email you later if anyone wants to get in touch. But thank you to our audience too. It's been a really, really interesting morning, and we do hope that you go away and put Antiquities at the top of your list now that you've heard from these, from our amazing panelists. Thank you, everybody.